Our oldest three boys are either working or have been working, and it's because there's no free rides. But Nathan, our oldest, has been working at Chick-fil-A, and Philip has been doing some grass cutting, lawn mowing during grass cutting season, and Andrew, until a few months ago, had been working at the Subway. That was the longest stint over at Adams Farm. And he lost that job, though, when they closed that location. You might have tried to go there and seen that they'd closed that Subway. Well, I was not, and we were not shocked when they closed that Subway because, truth be told, it was the poorest run, I would say restaurant, but any type of business that has ever sought to make a dime, that was the poorest run of all of them. It really was. It was just insane. And I don't know, I think the owner had several locations and just didn't care a whole lot or didn't feel like investing much to make sure that it was a decent experience when customers would go there. But first of all, like when you would approach the building, I don't think they ever had anybody mow grass or trim bushes or anything around there, so it kind of looked bad from the outside. It had a drive-through there, but somebody had hit the drive-through at some point and they never got that fixed. And the speaker stuff between the drive-through and the inside, that didn't work. And so what would happen is that the customers would pull up to the drive-through and like they would put a sign out there that says out of order, but if the sign blew away or it hasn't been up there in a while, a customer is just going to sit out there in the drive-through saying, excuse me, horn blowing, hollering, but no one could hear because it wasn't working, and you had no idea as a customer. The fountain machine went out and was out for, I'd say, more than a month, and it just wouldn't get fixed. And so if you'd want a Coke or Pepsi or whatever it was, they were so, yeah, well, I'm sorry, the machine's broke. The machine's always broke. I knew that this was not a tight-run machine when Andrew, at 14 years old, was given a key to the restaurant, and many times, I'm not making this up, was given a key to the restaurant, and many times would be left to close down shop by himself. So, just habit. Anyway, but one of the things that was interesting, though, is because he doesn't have his driver's license yet, for him to get there, we would have to go take him, and then we would pick him up. And the restaurant hours were that it would close, I think it was at 9 o'clock, like during the week, and like Saturdays and Sundays, or at least Saturday or Friday night, it might be open longer. But 9 o'clock would typically be, that's the stated hours that were on the door. And so we would get there typically some minutes early, but you would expect that the store is still open, that lights would still be on. And you would go many times, and the lights are off, the chairs are on the table, the door is locked, and it's like 8:30. And you can see some lights back in the kitchen where they're finishing cleaning up, and Andrew comes out, and because one of the things that we've seen is that customers would go sometimes, not tons of them, but you see some customers like try to go in because the sign says that they're still open, only to go pull on the handle and the door is locked, the lights are off, and the tables are on the chairs. And so repeatedly we had a conversation like this where we would talk about how is it that the place is already closed? And he's like, well, the boss said, well, it's just kind of slow, we'll just go ahead and close it. I said, you can't run a business like that. And so like if you have stated hours, and so if you say that you're open till 9, you kind of got to be open till 9. It has to be consistently like that, because if supposedly the restaurant opens at 11, but it actually doesn't open maybe until 12, or if it's open until 8 and you close it at 6:15, pretty quickly people are going to decide, I'm not going to go there anymore because I can't depend on that, because what they say and when it is that they're supposedly open, it's completely inconsistent. And so if they're going to run a business decently, you need to say, these are what the rules are, these are what the boundaries are, and we stick with this. This is how it is always. We appreciate that type of consistency. And many times in life, we expect that type of consistency, not just as it relates to restaurants and store hours, but in so many aspects of our lives, we want consistent expectations, and that these expectations are consistently, day in and day out. This is just how we roll. This is how it is that we operate.
We're thinking about that as part of our ongoing journey that we're calling This Is Us. And we've been thinking about 4 key essentials that were descriptive of the early church in Acts chapter 2 that were found. And because these things were found, I believe you're able to see, as we read in Acts chapter 2, some of these great and amazing things that God did. And what we see among them is that they were a church fellowship that they were biblically grounded, that they were meaningfully related, they were prayerfully focused, and they were gospel-centered. And we're spending some time unpacking each of these things and asking ourselves, is this true of us as a church? Is this true of us as a family unit? Is this true of me as an individual? Last week we started this whole idea of thinking about the extent to which in each of those areas we are prayerfully focused. And to say that we are prayerfully focused, or if a church or an individual or a family is prayerfully focused, that's saying that it's important, that things are operating around it, that this is kind of the central hub, and things are guided and shaped and limited and pursued, excuse me, based on the experience of talking regularly and consistently to God in prayer. And as it relates to this whole idea of prayer, if it is to be important, then we need to make sure that we as followers of God, that we're doing this the right way. And what I want you to understand is this, that God has expectations of how it is that I talk to Him that are not just occasional, that are not just sporadic, that these things are to be true and should be found every single time that I'm in conversation with Him, every single time that I call out to Him. And so the question we want to think about specifically today is rooted in that thought. What expectations of God should always, always, always shape my prayers? Look with me in your Bibles today to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to start reading with verse 5. This comes as part of a lengthier message that Jesus is sharing that we know as the Sermon on the Mount. And Jesus says this, starting in verse 5 of Matthew 6, "Whenever you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, because they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. Truly, I tell you, they have their reward. But when you pray, go into your private room, shut your door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. And when you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for their many words. Don't be like them, because your Father knows the things you need before you ask Him." Numerous important things that Jesus is describing about prayer here, but what He describes here really helps answer that question. That there are some expectations that God has of me, that He has of you, not just occasionally, not just sometimes, not between hours that fluctuate, but always, always, always that should shape how it is that I talk to Him. And one of the first things that we see is this: if others can see you, don't put on a show. If others can see you as you're praying, do not put on a show. Now, verse 5 starts with a simple word, but is altogether important and essential for us properly unpacking what Jesus is describing here. But first of all, He says, whenever you pray. And that word has connotation in 2 different directions. First of all, when He says whenever you pray, there is an assumption based on those words. There is an expectation that statement is rooted on. And the expectation, the assumption is this, that as a follower of Jesus, you actually pray. And this is not rocket science. I'm not trying to break new ground. I hope this is not a new thought to you, but here's the simple truth. If you are a follower of God and you profess to have a relationship with Him, He wants you to talk to Him. He expects that you talk to Him. Not just before a meal, not just when it feels like the sky is falling, but as part of having an ongoing relationship with Him, He expects that you talk to Him. So that's the underlying expectation, but beyond that, this word whenever conveys this thought. As you are talking to Him, whether it's in the morning or night, whether it's at work, whether it's at church, whether it's at school, whether it's in the car, wherever and whenever it is, this is what is supposed to guide it. This is what's supposed to shape it. And these are expectations that it doesn't make any difference what things are variant or are a variable. There's some things that are to always be true. And what should be true is this, that you should not be like the hypocrites. Now, this is a biblical word, and it's still a word that regularly we use in, maybe not every day, and certainly not every week or month necessarily, but regularly we use the word hypocrite. And certainly it is the case that you have a sense of what this word means, but this particular word literally means a pretender, an actor. And if someone is pretending or if someone is acting, what are they seeking to do? They are assuming a role. They are seeking to convey a sense about themselves that is different than how they actually are. Of course, there's good actors and bad actors. And like when I think of good actors, I think, honestly, Barney Fife is the one that comes to mind. It just is. And whether you're an Andy Griffith fan or not, consider this. If you ever watch an Andy Griffith episode, there is, like, Don Knotts becomes Barney Fife. I mean, like, you don't think, oh, this is somebody pretending, this is somebody acting. You're like, I mean, he is, like, he is Barney Fife. Why? Because he's a good actor. And he's taking this role and operating with this role, and he's presenting himself in such a way that there is no thought in your mind, oh, this is somebody that is pretending. This is someone that is acting. It's as if he becomes that person. And so Jesus says, I don't want you to be like that when it comes to prayer, where you are trying to present yourself in a way than what you actually are. And acting is not something that is limited to the movie screen, the TV screen, or to the stage in the theater, but unfortunately it's something that can be found in so many aspects of life, including even our prayer life. And Jesus says, as you pray, because that's expected that you do that, but every single time, you should not operate as someone that's a pretender, someone that's an actor. And he says this is how they do it. He says they pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by people. What are they doing? They are praying, but as they pray, the thought is this: where are the people? Who might be able to see me do this? And then let me go get in front of them. And so whether that's at the synagogue or it's on the street corner or in some public space, let me, as a follower of God, I should be praying. And so I'm going to run to get in front of people so that I might be able to offer this prayer to God. Understand what is being said here and what's not being said. Jesus is not prohibiting public prayer. And certainly it is the case when the people of God gather. And when we gather for worship, when you gather for Bible study, it is not just the norm, but it's expected that we ought to be, as groups, large and small, that we ought to be talking to God together. And that sometimes there are instances where someone is voicing a prayer to God on behalf of the whole group, whether it's big or small. He is not prohibiting that. What he's prohibiting is where you have an individual who is thinking about, with respect to prayer, how might this be an instance where more people can see me do this, so that I can get in front of them, so that I can be talking to God, or at least presenting myself as one who's talking to God, and they may actually see me. He's not saying that you should never pray at all in an instance where others can see you, but if they are able to see you, make sure that it's not a performance. Make sure that it's not a show. Don't do it like an actor, because what are actors doing? They're putting on a show. And Jesus says, do not do this. Because, he says, if you operate this way, and there were people in Jesus' day that were doing this, there are people today that do this. He says, don't do this, because, he says, I'm telling you, they have their reward. Now, on the surface, that may sound kind of strange, because we think of a reward as something positive. Oh, I get something back. And Jesus says, if you operate this way, you're going to get something back. There's a return on the investment. There is a reward. There's a bounty for praying this way. And what's the reward? Well, you get what you want. Oh, wait a minute. You mean that if I pray in front of people, and so anything that I say that I want from God, I get it. I get that. So if I'm in front of people and I say, God, I want $1 million, I get that because that's my reward for doing this in front of people? No. Look back at verse 5. He says they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to what? To be seen by people. That's what they want. And Jesus says, if you want to be a pretender, if you want to be an actor when it comes to prayer, you can do that. And it can happen when you pray in front of others to be seen by others. And if you want that, you can have that. So the question is this: what do I really want? Do I really want the God of heaven to hear me? Do I want the God of heaven to respond to me? Do I want to see Him working in particular ways in my life? Are there things that I need to express to Him that whether somebody is here in front of me or no one is here in front of me that I need to communicate to Him? Or do I want to be an actor? An actor that is seeking to convey to others that there are some things that are true of me that actually aren't. In this particular, well, I guess in truth, across Greensboro, there have been, and over the past couple of years, lots of panhandling that's been going on. And I think some city ordinances have changed from city council, and they put some no standing signs up. And you've seen in particular in this area at the intersection of Bridford Parkway and Wendover and around the Sam's and Walmarts, which had been like havens for panhandling, you've seen a massive reduction in this. But if you travel those areas or have been traveling those areas with some frequency over the past few years, one of the things that you probably noticed that there are some frequently seen individuals. And pretty quickly you realize, oh, this is kind of what their gig is. And some of these, and I'm not saying that it's true of all of them, but some of them, it is very clearly that they are frauds, and this is kind of their job. And I don't know about you, I've had my favorites. My favorite was this lady, and I'm not lying, better part of 2 years. So we're not talking about a period of weeks or months, but I'd say the better part of 2 years. She had the same message on her sign, that she was homeless and pregnant, and anything would help, God bless. All right, and then typically her regular place was, as you're approaching Wendover, she would be right there near where the Taco Bell and the McDonald's was, or is. But my favorite, the reason she was my favorite is because of this. Like, if there's no cars at the intersection, she's fine, but you could watch it. As cars would approach, the sign goes up. The face gets sad. There's never any tears. Green light. The other thing was this. She was pregnant for 2 years. Elephants are pregnant for 2 years. If you're pregnant for 2 years, or profess to be pregnant for 2 years, and you are not having an elephant, then what you're saying is not true. What was she doing? She was pretending. She was acting. And what do actors do? What are pretenders doing? They are seeking to get an audience, big or small, to believe things are true of them that are actually not. If and when you and I find ourselves, whether in small groups, it could even be in the home. It could be in a neighborhood Bible study. It could be in your Sunday school class. It could be as a part of this church. It could be part of the 4th and 4. It could be 1,000 different ways that we could do this, where there are opportunities to pray in front of others. If and when that happens and you have that opportunity, Jesus says, don't be putting on a show. Hypocrites do that. Pretenders do that. Actors do that. Where you're trying to get people to think, oh, they are so spiritual. Oh, a saint, their call to heaven is clearly a local call, where for everyone else it's long distance. Oh, my goodness, I could only hope to be like them one day. If you want people to think that of you, you can. If you want other people to be impressed by you, you can operate that way. But if you want God to hear you, don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. Whenever you pray, regardless of place, regardless of time, if others can see you, you make it a point, because Jesus says whenever. This is the rule. It's always this way. Do not put on a show. Public prayer is not prohibited, but the primary aim and how we're supposed to do this is where I get away, where you get away, and I have some time where it's just me and God. It's just you and God. So that you are able, in front of no one except the Lord himself, void of any pretense, void of any acting. Say what you need to say. If others can see you, don't put on a show, but there's another universal expectation that he gives, and that's this. Your sincerity matters more than your vocabulary. Your sincerity matters more than your vocabulary. In verse 7, Jesus continues by saying, when you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles, since they imagine they'll be heard for their many words. We've talked about this repeatedly, but in numerous cases in the New Testament, you have words like Gentile being used, and sometimes it's describing those that are not Jewish. And other times, and this is a case where Jesus is using this term to describe those that are actually outside of a relationship with God. So they could be professed pagans and idol worshipers or whatever, but these are not individuals that actually have a relationship with God. He says, don't pray like them, because, he says, what they do is they babble. They babble. It's interesting, the word that Jesus uses here that's translated as babble, because it's a term that conveys the idea of meaningless words. Literally, it's a word that means to stutter. To stutter. I used to have more problems with stuttering, especially when I was younger, than I do now. But think about it. If you have heard an individual stutter, or if you struggle with this, what's going on when you stutter? Well, you kind of get stuck on a syllable. So let's take the word stutter. If you're going to stutter with that word, you'll go stutter, right? I'm not making fun, but that's what's going on. Those first 4 or 5 syllables, do they mean anything? No, you're just trying to get to the word, but you're kind of hung up on those first syllables. So what's true of those first 4 syllables? They don't mean anything. They're just kind of noise. They're not the heart of the word. There's no meaning in there. It's just sound. And Jesus says people that don't have a relationship with God, one of the things that they do is that they pray and they say things either in content or in ways that are absolutely meaningless, that have no actual value. And so how is it that this can occur? I think it can happen, and sometimes you see it where you have individuals, especially in public settings, that get on a phrase, and it's almost, and sometimes you can tell that they're like working themselves into a frenzy where they take the same phrase and repeat it over and over and over and over and over again. And God, you are holy. 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 And I've got to think if God in heaven is hearing this and paying attention, he's like, I got you the first time. But it keeps on going, and it keeps on going, and it keeps on going, and it keeps on going. And why does it keep on going? I think many times because there's actually no meaning behind it. That there's some example that they've seen of others doing this, and they think, well, that's what should be going on. That's how you do this, repeating the same phrase over and over and over again. And the intent seems to be somehow, some way, he might hear me if I do something and say something over and over again. Another form that this can take is simply by going on and on saying so many things. That if I just say really, really, really long prayers, whether they are public or whether they are in private, if I go on ad nauseum, just going on and on and on again, that's what I should be doing. That I should be talking at enormous and considerable and incessant length. What might motivate someone to do this? Jesus says it's rooted in the thought that they'll be heard, that God is going to respond, that he's going to pay attention because of their use of many words. At the end of the day, what is that? Very simply, it's manipulation. I can, by the length of my prayers or the repetition of my phrases over and over again, doing this ad nauseum, on and on again, longer and longer and longer and longer, somehow, some way, by doing this, I can twist the heart, the mind, and the desires of God so that I get what I want. Do you really think that God is small enough to be manipulated by you? Do I really, really believe that God is small enough to be manipulated, that he can't see through my attempts to force him or attempt to twist him or contort him to do what I want? I'm telling you, God isn't deceived by this type of thing. He's just not. He sees that this is pretense. This is pretending. This is manipulation. And he says that Gentiles do this. They operate this way. In fact, they had been doing this since the days of the Old Testament. You remember when you had the showdown between the prophets of God and Elijah on Mount Carmel. You remember they're going to settle this once and for all. Who is the real God? They have this altar that has been erected, and they're going to call out, first of all, to Baal, and the God that is real is going to answer by consuming the sacrifice. And you remember what happened? The prophets of Baal, all 450 of them, they start in the morning. Oh, great Baal. Baal, 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 Baal. I don't know what you'd say to Baal, but they were saying it. And so they were praying, please, you hear us, respond with fire. That doesn't happen. And so they keep getting louder. And they are repeating themselves over and over again. Finally, they get to a point where they're even cutting themselves. And they're doing all this, and what happens? Nothing. Because Baal wasn't real. But why were they doing that stuff? They were doing so because they thought that somehow that the God they were calling out to would respond because they're doing that stuff. If we use a lot of words, if we say things over and over again, if we do that, then somehow, some way, we'll get God to do the stuff that we're actually wanting. And I'm telling you, God is not interested in that. And because that's a game. That's pretense. What he is interested in is not that at all. What God is actually interested in is plain, simple sincerity. And I think there's another way that we can get trapped in this, and that's to use what I would describe as prayer cliches, phrases that we have heard over and over and over again that become thoughtless phrases. And it's not that the phrases are untrue, but they just almost become word fillers. Our most gracious, glorious God and Heavenly Father, we call out to Thee into Thy great throne of grace, laying handle on the throne of mercy, so that, I've heard this many times, some of these phrases so many times over and over again, and I'm like, it's interesting that these phrases keep getting picked up and used over and over again, and many times I believe what is behind it is this, thoughtlessness. I'm just mimicking, I'm just repeating what I've done, what I've heard others do, what I've heard others say, picking up phrases that I have heard them use, and behind it is no actual thought and meaning. For me, as I think about that whole experience, I remember as a teenager going to camp one particular year, and the camp pastor that was preaching that week, I don't know if he said this more than once, but I know that in a prayer, he said this as he was finishing, and Lord, may we hear the soft, shuffling sound of sandaled feet as you walk among us. Really, that sounds really spiritual, though, doesn't it? Lord, may we hear the soft, shuffling sound of sandaled feet as you walk among us. Anyway, our pastor, this wasn't a good guy. The following Sunday, once we get back home, finishes a prayer, and Lord, may we hear the soft, shuffling sound of sandaled feet as you walk among us. And the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday, and the next Sunday. Kept hearing these empty, trite phrases over and over again. And I thought, the only aim of this is because that sounds really spiritual. Sounds really spiritual. But in truth behind it, there wasn't any real thought. It's interesting, and I think we're operating in changing times, not just with respect to culture, but we're operating with changing times as it relates to culture of church life in America. And one of the things that concerns me is that too many times we can fall into traps where our intent is, if push comes to shove, the intent is to convey a thought to each other. The intent is to present a display to each other. And we're trying to outdo each other in terms of being the coolest, newest trend and starting the next fancy thing in church life. But one of the things that I am certain that you have discovered throughout your life thus far is this. You always recognize sincerity. When somebody just shoots straight with you. When somebody is clearly not putting on airs. When somebody is just operating as who they are. That matters to you, doesn't it? Why don't we do the same thing with God? Because the truth is, he sees behind all the smoke and the mirrors. And there's not a phrase that I can use that impresses God. There's just not. There's not a statement that you can use that impresses God. But there are things that you can do that matter to God. That you can just talk to him, void of any pretense, with sincerity. Why? It's not just during particular hours, but morning, noon, and night. Your sincerity matters, always matters more than your vocabulary. The other Friday, Caroline and I had, she was getting ready to go on a walk, and I said, how about I go on a walk with you? And first she was like, anyway, it was over near Nathaniel, near the battleground area. We had gone on a walk, and we've had so much warm weather, and this was a day that it wasn't raining, and it was just altogether pleasant. And afterwards, she was talking about how much she enjoyed that. She said, I would so much rather do that than even going out to eat or somewhere. It was nice, just the two of us walking and talking. Void of any flash, void of anything else, just us. No kids, no distractions, just us talking. Listen, we value that with each other, and we ought to take that same value and apply it to our communication with God. And he's looking for me. He's looking from you and for you to have some plain, simple, honest conversation with him. Not trying to impress him because you're not. Not trying to manipulate him because you can't. Whenever you pray. So that assumes that this is the expectation all the time. And it assumes that you're a prayer. The question is, are you? You bow your heads with me?